I think all of us see the value of a church being at peace. We see that there's great benefit in that. We understand that when the people of God are united and peaceful, and they conduct themselves in that way, that relationships are better, that the work of the church is done more effectively, more efficiently, because we're not dealing with strife and internal issues that would complicate the things that we're trying to do as the people of God. We're reminded of passages like Psalm 133 in verse 1, where it says, "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." We think about Ephesians 4 and verse 3 that says that we endeavor to keep or to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We've all seen churches, and perhaps at one time in our own lives we've been a part of churches that were not at peace. We've seen the difficulties and the struggles that come with that, and we have seen what that does to the relationships in the congregation and how that affects the dynamic of the congregation. And when churches are not at peace, whatever the reason for that may be, maybe it's some unresolved difference, but that unresolved difference is oftentimes fueled by poor attitudes, and it leads to conflicts that never go away. Feelings get hurt, members leave, churches suffer, and ultimately Satan claims a small victory. So we see the value in peace and in unity, but how is that attained? How is that maintained? And so tonight I want to consider that with you, and I want to talk about three things that I think are critically important if this church and every church is going to maintain some degree of peace. Let me suggest to us, first of all, that if we're going to have peace in this local church, every member needs to be in a proper relationship to Jesus Christ. That's where it all begins. It all begins with my relationship to Jesus individually. We understand that Christianity is not something that we do by proxy. It's not something that we do by the herd, by the flock, just because I'm one sheep in the flock or one cow in the herd, just because I've cast my lot in with the right group. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right with God. And so it all begins at this individual level. We understand that Jesus came to bring peace on the earth. Isn't that what was announced, in fact, the day that he was born, the night that he was born? Peace on earth and goodwill to men. But in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14, it says that he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and he broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. In our scripture reading tonight, we read verses 11 through 13 that talk about the Jews and the Gentiles, the two classes of people, the two classes that all people fall into. You're either a Jew, you're either in covenant connection with God through Abraham, or you're not, or you're a Gentile, you're everybody else. And there was a distinction for 1,500 years between the Jews and the Gentiles. But Jesus came and he took away that distinction. He came to bring peace between both groups. And he came to make it possible that both groups could be in one fellowship together. Look at it again, verse 14, and we'll keep reading the next few verses. He himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and he broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. He came to preach peace to you who are far away. Who is that? It's the Gentiles. And he came to preach peace to those who are near, Israel, those who are already in close connection with God. All men who come to Christ and obey the gospel, share in fellowship together, joined into this one body that Jesus came to establish. And so we share in a very beautiful fellowship together. Go with me to John chapter 10. I want to see some language here that I think is comforting but also helpful for us to understand this idea. John chapter 10, begin reading at verse 11, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And of course, that's what Jesus did when he gave his life on the cross. He laid down his life so that he could redeem all of humanity. But if you skip down to verse 14, he says again, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now notice verse 16. I have other sheep, which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. I have other sheep. Well, who are the other sheep? It's those who were far off. It's the Gentiles. Jesus speaking to Jews here, and he says, I have other sheep beyond you. You who are already in covenant relationship with God. I have other sheep that I must bring into this fold. Other sheep who will come and be a part of this covenant people. People who are in this relationship with God. This is the fundamental essence of our unity. Because our unity as Christians and our unity in a local church is not settled, it is not established on any other basis besides Jesus Christ and every member being in right relationship to Him. If our unity is based on anything else, it's a false unity. If it's based on anything else, it's a temporary unity. Our unity is not based on political ideas. It's not based on matters of opinion in regards to various issues of life. It's not based on the fact that our kids go to school together and we're all part of the same PTA groups and all that. None of that matters. Now, those things may exist. We may have some of those things in common, but that's not the basis of our fellowship. The basis of our fellowship is that each member in this church is in a right relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the only basis for real unity. Now, if we understand that, let me give us a second thing that I think would be helpful to us. And that is that we need to have a proper respect for the elders of a congregation if we're going to have peace in the congregation. God has chosen that certain capable and qualified men serve in each local congregation as shepherds over that flock. And they follow the model of the chief shepherd. And these men, the New Testament tells us, are to be honored and they are to be respected. Look with me at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now in this passage, Paul does not explicitly say that he is referring to the elders. But when you read what he says, I don't know who else he could be referring to. Look at chapter 5 and verse 12. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction. I don't know who else it could be referring to when it says that there are men in the congregation who have charge over you in the Lord. And he says in verse 13 that we are to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. The work that shepherds are to do is to feed this flock with good teaching. And they do that sometimes through the preaching that may be done by an evangelist who works in conjunction with the elders. They do that by arranging and planning for the Bible classes that take place here. And we had a meeting just this evening at 4:30 to meet with teachers in our Bible classes. And the elders wanted to talk about ways that we could do that better. The elders do that when they teach Bible classes, maybe publicly or privately, when they have home studies with people. The elders do that when they are counseling with people, maybe marriage counseling or people who need financial counseling or some other kind of help. The elders are teaching. And so Paul says that we should esteem them highly because of their work. They feed us with teaching of God's Word. They guide us in the way that we ought to go according to the New Testament. And they are providing for our spiritual growth, and they're providing for our spiritual safety. And if we see the value of what it is that they're doing as shepherds, Paul says we should honor them and respect them for what they're doing. But notice at the end of verse 13, after talking about these leaders in the church and how we should esteem them and respect them, notice what he says at the end of the verse: live in peace with one another. You know, so often elders and issues and topics relative to elders become sources of contention in local churches rather than a source of peace. And it ought not be that way. I don't think it's a mistake that Paul, after talking about elders in a church, immediately turns the attention to the congregation and says, not only should you respect them and esteem them highly, but make sure that there's peace among you. And what that tells me when you combine those two thoughts is one of the ways that we can ensure peace in a local congregation is to honor and esteem the elders properly. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17, Hebrews 13 verse 17, Paul says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Sadly, I have seen men serving as elders who didn't do the best job keeping watch over the souls of the flock, and that's unfortunate. And this passage ought to be scary to such men, because notice the qualifying statement. Obey them, submit to them. Why? Because they're watching over your souls as those who will give an account. Our shepherds understand that one day they're going to stand before God and answer for how they led this congregation. And if that doesn't make a man sober up and take his responsibility seriously, I don't know what would. But if you continue reading, the Hebrew writer says, let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Isn't that interesting? Let the elders serve as elders. Let them shepherd you with joy instead of grief. And you would think that he would say, because that would be unprofitable for them. If you give them grief, they're not going to enjoy their labor and they're not going to want to do it anymore. That would be harmful to them. That's not what he says. It would be harmful to you, the one who is not letting them do this with joy. If you're the one causing grief, that's going to be unprofitable for you. Why? Because if our elders are constantly dealing with things that bring them grief, be it problem people or problem issues that have to be dealt with, maybe things that really they shouldn't have to be dealing with, and if that brings grief into their work as shepherds, they're not going to be able to perform what they ought to be doing to their maximum potential. And that's going to be detrimental to us as a flock. You with me? So let me suggest to us that the congregation has responsibilities toward its elders. We've already talked about one, that is that we should submit to their leadership and we should obey them in the decisions that they make, understanding that those decisions are oftentimes made in the best interest of the entire flock, not just a few sheep. But let me add to this that I think we need to be fair toward them. I think about what Paul said in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 19 when he said to Timothy, do not receive an accusation against an elder except by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Timothy, don't listen when an individual comes to you complaining about the elders and making some slanderous accusation against them. Don't even listen to what that individual is saying unless there's somebody else who can confirm the story. If someone comes to me, and I've said this to you before, and speaks ill of the elders to me, I don't listen to it unless there is more than one witness who can verify. Why don't I do that? because I realize that oftentimes elders have targets on their backs. Oftentimes they are treated unfairly. They are targets for criticism and perhaps unfair criticism. Sometimes we hold elders to impossible standards, even standards that the Bible does not demand of them. So let's understand that just because a man is serving as an elder, that doesn't mean he's a perfect man. That doesn't mean that he's never going to make a mistake. Our elders will be the first ones to tell you that. They have made mistakes, and they would admit that. But what we want to see in our leaders, and this is true of any person in a leadership role, be it in the church or in business or in schools or whatever, leaders learn and grow. And they learn and grow and they develop. And it's the same way with elders. But let me also suggest to us that elders have responsibilities to this congregation. Number one, they need to act in conformity with the leadings of the chief shepherd. Let's get a passage here. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 5. Just turn over a few pages. Hebrews, James, 1 Peter chapter 5. Look at what is said, 1 Peter 5 and verse 2, where Peter writes to the elders in his audience. He says in verse 2, chapter 5, "Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God. And not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock." Now notice verse 4. "And when the chief shepherd appears, you, elders, shepherds, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." When the chief shepherd appears. You see, the shepherds of this congregation are answerable ultimately and only to Jesus, the chief shepherd. What did he say in John 10? "I am the good shepherd." Peter calls him the chief shepherd. And the four men who serve this congregation, we might call them under shepherds. They serve under Jesus. And he is the only one that they answer to. And so they must lead this church in conformity with the leadings of Jesus. Let me suggest, secondly, that they need to have equal concern for every member. Because every member is in a right relationship with Jesus. And every member's soul is of equal value. So I think about the story that Jesus said in Luke 15 and in verse 4, that there was a man who had 100 sheep. And one of them was missing. And so he left the 99 to go and seek after the one that was straying. You know, he doesn't just cut his losses. Well, that was one of the old sheep anyways. Well, you know, he had a broken leg anyways. Wasn't all that valuable to begin with. No, he leaves the 99 and he goes to seek after the one because that one is valuable. And when he found the one, he threw it on his shoulders and he came back and he said to his friends, "Rejoice with me because I have found the sheep which was lost." And let me suggest thirdly that I think elders need to present united leadership to the congregation. That doesn't mean that elders always see eye to eye on everything. But it means that they have come to an agreement that there's going to be no division among us, and we're going to present united leadership to the congregation. So how can we maintain peace if we have proper respect for our elders and for the work that they're doing among us? Number 3, we need to have proper attitudes toward everybody. Proper attitudes toward everybody. There are many attitudes that have to be present for peace to be maintained. And I think about that story in Genesis 13 when Abraham and Lot had finally gotten to the point where they had both prospered and done well, and the land where they were just could not contain both of them anymore. Their herds were stumbling over each other, and their stewards, their servants were squabbling with each other. "That's my land, no, that's my land, and you took water out of my well, and no, that's my well." And it's kind of like a bunch of kids griping, you know, "Well, I called it," right? And so they had to part ways. But what did Abraham say in chapter 13 and verse 8? Do you remember? He said, "Don't let there be any contention between us because we are brethren." We're brethren. We're kin. We're family. Don't let this become a source of division among us. And I think that we need to consider that as we think about our relationships to each other. What attitudes do we need to have? Well, they were supposed to come up one at a time and be somewhat of a surprise, but they're not. It all begins with love. It all begins with love. Look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I heard this passage read at a wedding once, but that's about all I know of it. Well, I got a few snickers. I put on the screen verses 4 through 7, and that's really the most familiar portion of this text. This is the portion of the text where love is patient, love is kind, and etc. We know that part. But do we back up and catch the first 3 verses of the chapter? Where Paul says in verse 1, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, wouldn't that be something? What are the tongues of angels? I don't know, but I bet it's pretty. What do angels sound like when they speak? What do they sound like when they sing? I don't know, but I bet it's pretty. Paul says if I can speak just as angels speak, but I do not have love, he says it's not pretty. It is a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all mysteries and I have all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, then I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. I could be the greatest person that's ever walked the face of the earth, save Jesus himself, and if I don't have love, it's worthless. Think about the problems in Corinth. You read through this first letter and you scratch your head and you say, this is the worst church I've ever seen. This is terrible. Look at everything that they were dealing with. How's the church going to make it through all these problems? And apparently they did. How are they going to do it? I don't think Paul includes 1 Corinthians 13 in this book as an accident. You got problems? Yeah, you got real problems. But there are no problems that genuine love and concern for your brothers and sisters in Christ cannot fix. Too often, churches split and divide over problems that could have been avoided if brethren would just act like they were supposed to act in the first place. We need to have mutual respect. Respect for the worth and the value of every member. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Just turn back one page. Paul talks about this. He says in verse 20 that there are many members, but there is one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Or again, the feet, or the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, it is much truer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary. And those members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it. But God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to the member which lacked, so that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. Your body, your physical body, is composed of many different parts. Which of those parts would you want to do without? You know, I've seen people do without. Maybe they've had a leg amputation or some other kind of calamity that has befallen them, and because of that, they have been dismembered. Or maybe someone has been stricken with blindness, and the sense that they once had, they no longer have. Which would you want to do without? It's not a trick question, right? He says, none of them. I want them all. Why? Because when you have all of them, when you have all the members, your body is functioning at its maximum capacity. And so our hands don't say to our feet, well, we don't need you. We can get along fine without you. Really? Or, our eyes don't say to our ears, well, we don't need you. We don't need your ability to hear. We can see. Seeing is the best, and you can just go somewhere else. No, we don't do that. We need it all. We want it all because the body has been so composed in a wonderful and miraculous way, a miraculous design by God, that our body functions as it does. And Paul says the body of Christ is the same way. And so we need to be very careful about looking down upon members of the body and saying, well, you're not as valuable as I am, or you're not as valuable as somebody else is, because when we start taking members out, the body does not function to its maximum potential. Verse 25 highlighted that there may be no division in the body. Why is it that we all need to have the same concern for one another? Because we don't want division. What are we talking about tonight? Peace. Maintaining peace. Now, go with me to Romans chapter 14. I spent more time in Corinthians 12 than I intended to. But look at Romans chapter 14. We could spend 2 or 3 sermons talking about Romans 14, and maybe we'll do that one day. This is a rich chapter, but let's just hit some of the high points here. In Romans chapter 14 and verse 1, Paul says, now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. So the weak person of verse 1 that Paul says you need to accept the weak person, but don't just accept him so you can make fun of his judgments. He tells us who the weak person is in verse 2. It's a person who only eats vegetables. Why? Doesn't say. But for whatever reason, he has a conscience about that. Now, I think we could offer some pretty good guesses as to why he may feel that way. Well, I don't know what's been done with that meat. Maybe it's been sacrificed to idols, and I don't want to participate in that. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 talks about that at length. I don't want to participate in that, so I'm just not going to eat any meat at all. I'm just going to eat vegetables. Now, verse 3 is important. The one who eats, that is the one who eats everything, vegetables and meat, the one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Underline that, at least in your mind. Both of these men are accepted by God. They're both right before God. And I say that that's important because sometimes, and you'll see this if you do any deep study on controversial issues, when you study controversial issues, there will be at least 2 schools of thought. If it's a truly controversial issue, there's probably more like 47. But there's going to be at least 2 schools of thought that cannot both be right. And what happens a lot of times is somebody will say, hey, you know what? You think this way, I think this way. Let's just Romans 14 the issue. And so it's some false doctrine that's out there. And a guy says, well, let's just sweep it under the rug of Romans 14. You can't do that. Romans 14 is not about doctrinal disagreements about what's truth and what's not, because both men are accepted by God. And when it comes to doctrinal truth, if someone is preaching something other than what the New Testament reveals, it's not acceptable to God. You with me? Now, there may be 2 people who have differing opinions on certain matters, whatever those matters may be, but they're matters of judgment, they're matters of opinion, they're not matters of truth. Paul says you respect each other and you get along with each other because God has accepted each of you. And so we dare not say to a brother or sister in Christ, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I'm going to cast you out of the fellowship like Diotrephes, because Paul says God didn't do that to that man. You did. And you can't put yourself in the seat of God. These differences don't need to become dividing issues between us. The strong man doesn't belittle the weak man. The weak man doesn't look to the strong man and say that he's wrong. We don't act in ways that cause one another to stumble. Verse 13 tells us, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. Your man who only eats vegetables, don't invite him over to your house and serve him prime rib. Don't put a stumbling block before him. determine not to tear down the one for whom Christ died. Verse 15, for if because of food your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. Let's end with verse 19. So then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. And so now that I've talked about Romans 14 a little bit, I feel like I want to preach a whole series on it. So maybe we'll do that sometime. Finally, let's end with this. We all need a heavy dose of humility all the time, myself included. That is something that I think sometimes we get tired of hearing. We talk about the dangers of pride. We talk about the need for humility, and we talk about it a lot. Why do we talk about it so much? Because we need it. Because we need to talk about it so much. And we need it in every aspect of our lives. We need it in every aspect of our religious lives before God. And so in Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4, Paul said, don't act from selfishness or conceit, but esteem others as greater than yourself. Satan has ruined many individuals. He has ruined many churches through pride. Now I want to look at another passage in Philippians. I want to go to chapter 3. And this will be our last passage this evening. Philippians chapter 3. Look at verse 19. Well, let's back up to verse 18. For many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. What are you going to do about these kind of people? You know, Paul said in chapter 1 that there were people who were preaching Christ, but they were doing it from the wrong motivations. And I've struggled with what he said there, because he said, I'm just not going to worry about it, and I'm going to rejoice in the fact that Christ is being proclaimed. I struggle with that, because I wonder how effective can a preacher be if his motives are selfish? If his motives are pride and the building up of his own ego, how successful is he going to be in reaching people with the gospel message? I struggle with what Paul said. But there are some who have these carnal appetites and they have these carnal attitudes, and ultimately, it seems, that these people are seeking their own interests, and pride has so much to do with that. In contrast to what he said in chapter 2, don't seek your own interests, seek the interests of others. These people are seeking their own interests. And Paul says, watch out for them. So humility causes us to give preference to one another. And when we do that, it promotes peace. So we have to make the determination that we're going to think as we should, that we're going to act as we should, and when we all conduct ourselves properly, when we all view one another properly, when we all view our elders properly, and when we're all determined to maintain peace, then peace is going to prevail. Right relationship to Jesus, right respect for our leaders, and right attitudes toward everyone. And you know, I love lessons like this because I didn't tell you a single thing tonight. I didn't tell you a single thing tonight that you didn't know already. God's formula for peace is so simple. And I think that's one of the things that makes it beautiful. But so often, we want to move beyond the simple. We want to come up with the new, the exciting, the different, the more complicated. And yet in so many ways, God's way, the simplest way, it's the best way. God's ways work, and I hope that we trust that. I hope we believe that. If you're not a Christian, you don't know that peace that Jesus can bring to your life. We want you to participate in that. We want you to share in that. We want you to come and be a part of this church, not because we are interested in having bigger numbers that we can post on the board and say, look how big of a church we are. We don't care about that. We only care about numbers insofar as each number represents a soul that needs to be saved. That's all that matters, folks. And so if you're not a Christian, we want you to think about your soul. We want you to do what's best for your soul, and that is coming to Jesus. And if we can help you tonight, we invite you to come kneel at the cross as we stand and sing together.